The murder rate in this country is through the roof. And you don't see the Democrat Party and the media and their surrogates worried about much of that. You don't see them having days of mourning for the people who've been murdered as a result of Democrat public officials and Democrat policies, do you? And yet there's genocide going on in this country. 15, 16, 17,000 people will be murdered each year. We have records in Philadelphia, records in San Francisco, records in Seattle and Portland, records in New York, records being set all over this country in Democrat-controlled cities and areas for the most part. No, there's not going to be hearings about that. There's not going to be a day of mourning and remembrance about that. There's a complete disconnect between what goes on in Washington, D.C. and the rest of this country. A complete disconnect between these phony historians who are Democrats, these phony journalists who are Democrats, and the Democrats, and we the people. They're propagandists. They push these big lies. So let's take a look. MSNBC, go.
He's not just a former president. He's a defeated former president. A former president who lies about this election. And the mob that attacked this Capitol could not be further away from the core American values. They want to rule, or they will ruin. You can't love your country only when you win. You can't obey.
Oh, really? Did they remember that in 2016? Of course not. These people are full of bullshit. I'm sorry, but I have to say it. They're full of crap. 2016, they spent years trying to destroy Donald Trump. They trumped up one charge after another. Criminal investigations that go nowhere because there was nothing. Russia collusion, lies with the collusion between Hillary Clinton, the DNC, money laundered through their favorite law firm, lies at the FISA court, phony documents and evidence ginned up against the President of the United States and his people. Efforts by the top of the FBI to topple the president with the 25th Amendment and leaks to the media. Efforts in the Oval Office by the President of the United States and Vice President of the United States to keep pushing this Russia collusion lie. You had the former head of the National Intelligence. You had the former head of the CIA all over cable TV lying about Russia collusion and Trump's ties. And we now know, thanks to a criminal investigation after the fact, they were all lies. They were all planted by the Hillary campaign, all paid for by the Hillary campaign. Talk about dirty tricks and Richard Nixon. We have never seen anything like this. And then they tried to build impeachment around it and a criminal investigation around it and coup efforts around it and on and on. Man leaves office, they impeach him after he leaves office. They lie. Even Biden, over and over again, lies during this disgusting speech, this hateful speech, in which he unloads his personal animus towards the former President of the United States. They lie. They say that he encouraged the mob to attack the Capitol building. No, he didn't. He said to be peaceful, as a matter of fact. He offered 10 to 20,000 National Guardsmen. Does that sound like somebody wants an insurrection? The people who did break into the Capitol building, they weren't armed. They didn't shoot anybody. They didn't let off bombs like the Weather Underground or shoot people like the Puerto Rican nationalists, all of whom were pardoned by various Democrat presidents. They didn't do any of that stuff. And as a matter of fact, you have videotape where Capitol Police are waving people in by the dozens, waving them in, and those people are being charged. Most of the people who have been charged, most of the people who are in this D.C. gulag are being charged eventually with trespassing and parading on government property. How many times have you heard about prosecuting people for trespassing and parading on government property? How many Antifa or Black Lives Matter protesters, violent protesters, rioters have been charged with trespass or parading on government property? How many of those people from Code Pink and so forth who were protesting the Kavanaugh hearings, who were parading on government property, how many of them were charged with crimes and thrown into D.C. jail? Many of the people in the D.C. jail, the D.C. gulag, haven't been charged with anything. They're sitting there waiting to be charged. They're sitting there waiting to be arraigned. They haven't had their day in court. Nobody cares about that. January 6th, the day the nation was threatened. Threatened by whom? There was no armed insurrection. They went ahead and had their count. The building was not destroyed in any way similar to the way it was destroyed by the Puerto Rican nationalists or the Weather Underground or other members of the Democrat Party base, as it turns out. No, 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 no. And yet there we have January 6th, the same people who lied to us, who pushed Russia collusion, the same people who covered up the whole Hunter Biden matter. These are the people today who are now telling us the truth about democracy. These are the people who ignore what took place between 2016 and 2020 with Mark Elias, the Perkins Coie law firm, and hundreds of other lawyers, changing the election laws from sea to shining sea, with their Democrat governors, their Democrat-elected Supreme Courts, their Democrat judges and boards of elections and secretaries of states, who violated the federal Constitution and overturned election laws that were put in place by the state legislatures, the only body that has the power to do so under the federal Constitution, which the Supreme Court refused to hear. Shocking and outrageous. Shocking and outrageous. You're not allowed to talk about those things. No, the 2020 election was the cleanest election in American history. It was the most absurd election, with drop boxes and governors sending out ballots to people that didn't even exist, who didn't even ask for them, less standards and less ability to monitor what was taking place in any election in modern American history, and yet we're told it's the cleanest ever. There should be no audits. And forget about Zuckerberg and his over $400 million that he spent to get out the Democrat vote. Ignore it all, ladies and gentlemen. And if state legislatures, 19 Republican state legislatures so far, try to fix things, not to stop the vote, if they try to fix things, not to prevent minorities from voting, but to prevent illegal votes from the Democrats grabbing power illegally, institutionalizing fraud. If you do that in your Republican legislature, well then, they project onto you their own history. You must be part of Jim Crow. You must not want people to vote. And the media regurgitate this, and their favorite historians regurgitate this. And they tried to tie this whole thing on January 6th to what? What they call voting reform. What we really should call voting lies and voting fraud. Now imagine this quickly, and I've talked about this before. Their package on voting, do you know what it includes? Absolutely no voter ID. So illegal aliens will be able to vote. As a matter of fact, nobody at the precinct, including an election judge, is allowed to challenge those voters. They're not allowed to ask them for any form of ID. Well, gee, how's that going to work? Not well. 16 and 17-year-olds could register to vote even though they're not supposed to vote. Well, if you're not allowed to check their ID, how do you know? Well, you get the point. And it's even worse than that. You don't have to vote in your own precinct. You can vote in any precinct. Well, what's that going to result in? People voting in multiple precincts. Oh, and by the way, states may not review their voter lists for people who've died or people who've moved or anything of the kind. They're prevented from doing it. And I can go on and on and on. Does that sound like voting reform, or does that sound like California? Does that sound like a Democrat Party that wants to nationalize the election process in violation, again, of the federal Constitution, to destroy the red states and to grab power, a one-party country? That's what it sounds like to me. The same reason they want to pack the Senate with 4 more Democrat senators. The same reason they want to pack the Supreme Court with result-oriented leftists. Oh, yes. And the same reason they try to destroy Donald Trump, who they obviously fear, desperately fear, with their phony Stalinist-like committee that leaks text messages that they shouldn't even have, that has no purpose at all other than do the bidding of Nancy Pelosi and the Democrat Party and Joe Biden. Go ahead.
You can't obey the law only when it's convenient.
The law only when it's convenient. Really? Did you hear this man talk about that when he was hiding in his basement during the campaign? When Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and other reprobates, miscreants, and malcontents were burning our cities, were looting our stores, were attacking people randomly in their cars and on the streets, and were killing people? Did you hear about him talking about law only when it's convenient? Or the multiple times the Democrats tried to destroy Donald Trump? Or the 2016 election, or for that matter, the 2000 election, when the Supreme Court had to step in and stop the Supreme Court of Florida from violating the federal Constitution? Or 2004, when they said John Kerry actually won? No, you don't remember any of that. Well, I want to move off this because I don't want to spend the whole show talking about a man who can barely think, who slurs his speech, and who's just a hater. What about his job? What about the things that he's failed to do? Look at inflation. It's a disaster. Anybody who wants to buy anything knows that, from food to automobiles to refrigerators to anything. It's a disaster if you can get it. The supply chain is still broken. The border's broken and wide open, purposely. They're destroying the finances and the currency of this country. Those of you on Social Security, those of you who have a pension, you're going to be punished the worst. Those of you who are having to drive, truckers who are having to drive, the price of fuel is nuts. Energy independent, low prices, and now look what's taking place in this country. And we can go on and on and on about the disaster, about the wrecking ball that is Joe Biden as he stands there, pontificates. It's really repulsive. He's repulsive as far as I'm concerned.
Want to see more Mark Levin? Go to LevinTV.com and subscribe now.